Okay, guys, I think we will start now. So, hello to everyone, and thank you for attending. I know that a lecture without a test at the end bears certain temptations not to come and to do something more connected with your personal project instead. For example, watching Netflix. Therefore, I'm really grateful for coming, for having you today. So, but what exactly are we talking about today, and what the hell am I doing up here? Well, to answer the first question, we'll dive into some different topics, which will sound a bit like science fiction, but are actually the reality of our times. To knit it a bit down, we will talk about artificial intelligence and the different approaches to it. In the second part, we will talk about the impact these technologies have on our economies and our societies as a whole. And in the end, I will give an outlook on what could be achieved by our generation. To answer the latter question, why am I qualified for talking about a topic like this, let me introduce myself. My name is Dennis Özdemir, and as many in this room may know or may not know, I'm a fellow 1A student of yours in the URM program. Hello. And the only thing that's different from me and the normal 1A student is that CSPO is not my first educational path. Before I came here, I actually attended a HTL in Austria, which is basically, to put it very simply, a fine mixture between secondary school and bachelor's degree in technology. So my majors were in computer science and electronics. And in that capacity, in 2016, I wrote a book about what developers call collective intelligence on the basis on cloud computing theory. The 300 pages book with the title Cloud Robotics was, to be honest, not necessarily a New York Times bestseller. But nonetheless, in order to prove what I was saying in the book, I led a team of 4 very talented software and hardware engineers in order to do a practical project to show that what we were saying theoretically actually was the truth, right? So at this point, please meet Bruno. Bruno is what engineers call a hexabot, or to put it very simply, a spider. He's in cases of muscle power and motion abilities, he's a clockwork, a masterpiece. But when it comes to brain development, Bruno is rather simple-minded. To understand why this is so, let me introduce to you the basic ideas of my project and of cloud robotics and itself. And to understand it, hello? And to understand that, I will first ask you to think about ants. Quite peculiar creatures, aren't they? The colonies have fascinated humankind since the dawn of times. But there is really something special about them. As scientific research has shown, cruelty in the name of science, one could say, a single ant on itself has a very, very limited repertoire of behavior. You know what happens to an ant that gets lost in an outdoor exhibition crew? Well, she wanders around until she finds a way back to her colony, until she dies out of starvation or exhaustion. But when you take, instead of one ant, a whole colony of ants, or an outdoor exhibition group in that case, that changes the game. Suddenly our little friends show a very, very effective behavioral repertoire and they show a certain degree of intelligence in cases of food search, logistics, and colony organization. This phenomena is known under the name collective intelligence, and it comes about through collaboration, competition, and common efforts of many individuals. Cool, but what has this to do with artificial intelligence, you may ask? Well, if you just replace the colony of ants or a swarm of birds in that regard by a community of robots, you're exactly at the point which fascinated me and became the center of my academic work some years ago, cloud robotics. So As the name already implies, cloud robotics involves two components. A, you have a place in a network, for example the internet, where you can exchange information. We call that a cloud. You may already know clouds from when you exchange pictures of your last party holidays with your friends, or exchange snapshots of students who fell asleep in CSPO during classes or things like that. So clouds may already be something you know. But there is a second component to it, as the name implies, robotics. This means that in this data sharing process, you have also not only humans involved, but also one or more robots. So when you have interaction between humans and robots, you get something like this message I get quite often recently from Google Maps. Please answer quick questions, we need some human help. So yeah, here the robot wants to gather some knowledge from you. But this is not the whole picture. There's also a second part to it. When you speak exclusively of robot interaction and in that regard of a robot community, you're exactly in the field where I'm specialized in. Well, to walk you through every idea and all the theoretical models and everything I showed in my book, it would take weekly lectures to do that. And that would be just a theory. To gain the programming skills and the hardware understanding would take years. So obviously I will spare you this point, but I will give you a brief oversight of what we did, right? So basically the task at stake was to move a heavy-duty vehicle through an unknown maze in a very short amount of time. So without a single misstep at the first try. But how do you do that? Well, the thing we came up was to design a second robot, a little automobile car, a miniature self-driving car, who was equipped with distance sensor measurement systems, so he knew at every point how far a wall was away from him or other obstacles. He was able to find out at which exact point within a room he is, and he was also programmed with algorithms to find a way through every maze. Not at the first try, maybe not at the second try, but at least when he has tried out every other way, he knows where the right way lies. So this was a quite interesting part of the project because, you know, it's very difficult to find out where exactly in a room a robot is because you cannot use GPS data inside a building. GPS is only available outside of buildings. So, but that's not the main part I want to talk about today. The main point I want to make is with his robot brother, whom we have already met, Bruno. Well, as I already said, Bruno is simple-minded. He has no sensoric systems. He's not programmed to know where he is in the room. He basically is only made for one thing and one thing only, to move. He knows nothing else. But as led by a higher power, Bruno was able to escape these software limits and find his way through every maze by every first try. How is that possible? Well, as miraculous as it may sound, actually it's not. It's just the phenomena of collective intelligence. As it was, the little roadrunner was actually in deep conversation throughout the whole project with Bruno. You can imagine something like that. They exchanged friendly words in a friendly environment of a cloud. And the little maze runner told Bruno exactly how to get through every maze by the first try. They exchanged this information. So what does this mean for us and our future? Well, this is very simple to answer, but also quite shocking. I mean, it means nothing less than a robot can do any task without being programmed for it, just by being connected with another robot and exchanging information with them. Just imagine a community of robots connected to the internet, the mecca of all human knowledge, already available for every robot who has the computing power to grasp it. I know while I was doing research in the field some years ago, at Google there were talks about setting up something like a robo app store, where a robot could just download the expertise he needs very consciously and to do any task he wants, right? I could imagine something like this. So, when robots are connected to the internet and can get any expertise they want in any field they want, starting from aviation, over surgery, going through tutoring, and yeah, you name it, right? And they can just access it in the internet. Where is place for us humans anymore? I would encourage you to think about this question while I will come to it in the second part of my presentation. At this point, I want to say that I do see the advantages of artificial intelligence and the virtues it brings with it. I did not spend 6 years of my life working in this field because I'm an evil person and want the human race to be obsolete. No, there are certainly good things about it. I dreamt when I was working on projects like this. I was dreaming about how one day cloud robotics could help surgeons to perform surgery without being at the place of the accident, just by instructing a robot. I dreamt of cloud robotics being a place to find solution for the illnesses of humankind, like cancer, or mental illnesses like dementia and stuff like that. I dreamt of setting up robots in a cloud in order to instruct them and send them out to Mars and build the first human-friendly bases to prepare everything for human immigration to outer space. And I still dream of these things. But today I'm strongly convinced that there are certain rules which, and that's quite important, have to be respected in order to guarantee that to the stability of our society as we know it. I will come to these rules in the third part of my presentation. Let's now look into another approach to artificial intelligence other than cloud robotics, and maybe the one you may have already heard, because it's more the fancy one, the thing everybody does in Silicon Valley at the moment. It's like the hipster onto the artificial intelligences. It's deep learning. You may know it either under the name machine learning, deep learning, I don't know. Well, deep learning is an even more complicated field and involves even heavier mathematical models, and so obviously I will just scratch on the surface and explain what it is about. So there are some tasks which are quite easily done by a robot and are quite complicated for a human. For example, solving mathematical equations, selling and buying stocks on the stock market. Those things are very complicated for a human because it involves a lot of thinking. But a robot does this in not even a second. That's because you can describe a mathematical formula within a very simple model. You can modelize it. But there are some things, some tasks which come very natural to a human, but are quite nearly impossible for a normal robot to do. Those are things like face recognition, speech recognition, to find out the subtle meaning of something a person says just by changing the tone. Those are things that come natural to a human. But a robot obviously has problems with it because you cannot describe that so easily in one model, because it's something of more complexity. And what scientists came up with to solve this problem was to basically build the software equivalent of what we think how the human brain functions. I mean, still, we don't know everything about the human brain. But to the best of our knowledge, that's what neurologists think the human brain works, and that's what computer scientists try to build the equivalent of. So I will try to explain it with an example. Think of a picture. So picture, and you want to recognize a face on it. The task at stake is quite complex to describe in one single model. So what you want to do is to simplify it, to put the task into pieces, to make it easier to solve one piece after another. So for example, you can start by taking the picture into the first layer of a software, and the only task the first layer is meant to do is to find out which are different colors have I. For example, when you imagine Okay, there is a human, there is a car, there's a tree. So you have something like maybe the car is red, you have the color red, you have green, you have blue, I don't know. So that's very easy for a computer to find out which are the different colors he sees on a picture. So when he has the results of that, of the first step, he goes to the second layer. And at the second layer, he wants, for example, to find out where are the borders between the colors. Where does one color starts and where does the other end? Well, with the information, which colors are in the picture, and with the picture itself, we can go to the second layer. And based on the results from the first layer, you can find out very easily where the borders are. In the next layer, he can find out where does more than two colors are connected to each other. Where are the corners of colors, right? So, and step by step, he comes to a point where he will recognize your face, and he will be able to recognize within under 1 million pictures, when you're on 2 pictures of those million pictures, he will recognize your face on those 2 pictures. Well, as deep learning is, as I said, something quite complex in itself, and so I won't go into much more detail. For everyone who is really interested in it, I feel free to come to me after the lecture, and I will refer to you some textbooks and articles I like about the topic. Whew. That was quite heavy information to swallow, right? Maybe we should go on with something more relaxing. Personally, I'm a bit of an art fanatic. So one day I even spent a whole day in Paris in the Louvre just appreciating all the fantastic pictures, all the masterpieces. So in that spirit, let us do some little quiz. I will show you a picture and will tell me who is the author and what is the name of the picture, right? So let's start with an easy one. Who is that? It's a serious question. Obviously, yeah. Okay, let's go on to one of my favorites. Which one is this, and who painted it? Yeah. Right. Okay, let's change to more contemporary arts. I'm not a big fan of contemporary arts, but it still is part of when we talk about arts, we have to have a look at it. So who painted this? No contemporary arts fans here? Well, this one is quite famous, actually. I think this is even from an exhibition of the Tate Modern, and the painter actually has a lot of exhibitions all around the world. The peculiar thing about it is that the painter himself is not a human. The painter is AI. And he's one of the most respected contemporary artists in today's art scene. And as I said, has exhibitions all around the world. Well, at this point I want to introduce you to another little fellow. His name is Watson. Watson is a project of IBM. For those who do not know, IBM is one of the pioneers in things of personal computers. So together with Apple and together with Atari, they built the first personal computers back in the 70s and 80s. I think IBM started in the 80s. The reason why you maybe never have had an IBM computer in your hands is because they sold their business in 2005 to Lenovo. So when you have a Lenovo laptop or something like it, you're working on the framework of IBM. But just because they sold a personal computer history doesn't mean that they just ceased to exist, right? Far from it, they just specialized. They specialized in different fields, and one of them was artificial intelligence. And the project they came up with was Watson. Watson can be used for many different things. Watson is working with cognitive computing. It's basically more narrowed down version of deep learning, as we've encountered. So there are many uses for Watson, but what I think is the most interesting one is Watson in the as a healthcare solution. So Dr. Watson as physician. You know, Watson is specialized to read through patients' data, to read the patient's gene sequences, to read the notes another physician has made on the patient, to go through which drugs, which medicaments the patient uses, and to connect all this information with related journal articles, and then in the end come up with diagnoses and treatments for the patient. The only thing left for the physician to do is to communicate with the patient. And that is for the simple reason that that our society is constructed in a way that humans feel more comfortable to tell the problems to a human than to a robot. But that could change within a generation if we tell our kids that it's perfectly normal to tell a robot how you feel, then they will do it, right? I don't think that's the big problem. The only reason why you don't see Watson in every hospital in the developed world today is because healthcare data is quite difficult to access. A lot of it is not digitalized, so there are a lot of handwritten notes on patients. You have a lot of different, especially in the USA, you have different healthcare records in different hospitals and stuff like that. So, but IBM is not idle. They are buying and building companies who are gathering healthcare data and building up a cloud in order for the different Watsons to access. So here should ring a bell because this is the connection point between cloud robotics and deep learning. So at one point, not far from here in the future, we may encounter a society in which physicians have a quite similar role to modern head of states, that of a figurehead. They're only here for communicating. So I hope nobody in this room meant to skip CS4 and change to medical university, because don't. You know, something that's quite interesting when you talk with people who have no deep knowledge of technology and you talk with them about artificial intelligence is that they are so convinced that there are certain tasks a robot will never be able to do. And one thing, so this maybe illustrates people taking the wrong enemy, enemy for friend and friend for enemy. No, it's not like that, but well, one task that comes up very often when you talk about tasks robots will never be able to do is a lawyer. Well, a lawyer is the textbook example of a task a robot with deep learning skills can do. And guess what? They already do. At this point, I will want to introduce you to the project Do Not Pay, which is set up by a 19-year-old Stanford student. And it's basically an online legal counseling service. That's nothing new. In the US, that's quite common to get your first legal counseling online from an expert when you want to find out if you have a chance to win a case and stuff like that. So that's not the new thing. The new thing is that the expert on the other side is not a human, but an artificial intelligence. And the other new thing is that he doesn't charge anything, so it's for free. You think that's you don't quite believe me? Well, fair enough, let's have a look. So I don't know if it's clear to read, I don't think so, so I will read out the part of the last letter they exchanged. So This is from the artificial intelligence on the other side. To whom it may concern, thank you for taking the time to read this letter. I'm writing on the basis that when I looked at John Smith, BA 456, the flight in question was delayed by John Smith. The decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union in Tal and others versus CAA confirmed the availability of compensation for delay as set out in the Sturgeon case. I'm therefore seeking to apply EC Regulation 261 2004 for this delayed flight. Quite impressive, huh? So for anyone in this room who thought about going into a law career after CS Pro and is a bit troubled now, well, yeah, it should be. I mean, he's not perfect, of course not. He only works in the US and in the UK and in Europe, and not for every part of the law, right? So he's not perfect yet, but he's getting there. I mean, you can go with this letter to every court and sue, and it's an official document because it's everything is just fine as a lawyer would do it. And by the way, the music you heard in the background was also made by artificial intelligence. Her name is Emily, and she does classical music like this on a daily basis. So, and just for the sake of fun, I will now introduce you to a company, which is actually a sister company of Google, and also a US military contractor. The name is Boston Dynamics. And they are a military contractor. They're building weapons and equipment for the US military. So let me introduce to you your human body atlas. Wait. I don't know why these videos never work. So if you think it's good or not for the US military to have super soldiers like this, well, that's up to you. And as a good friend of me has made me aware of, Boston Dynamics actually, they announced and showed off a new project just a few days ago. And I thought it's very interesting, and I wanted to show this one too. So at this point, I have to be honest, it's since this project is just a few days old and Boston Dynamics did not produce any statement to their new project, we don't know if this is happening with artificial intelligence or if it's steered still, controlled by humans. So we don't know anything about this project yet. But yeah. Wait. Okay, so now I want to conclude with the project which was for me the most frightening one as a computer scientist they came up with the last years. And it was actually done by a company you might know. Its name is Facebook. And I think 1 or 2 years ago they thought about the great idea to connect two of the artificial intelligences and to, let them trade. They wanted them to trade balls, an uneven number of balls, and they thought them to come up with a solution in the end, who gets how many balls. Well, the project kind of turned into a peculiar situation, and you had headlines like the following all over the world at the time. Facebook's artificial intelligence robots shut down after they start talking to each other in their own language. So what happened? Well, as it seems, after a period of time, when Alice and Bob, the two artificial intelligences who were connected, they just stopped using the English language to speak with each other. They developed their own language. And I mean, and it was a language which could not be decoded by any computer scientist or any linguistic specialist. So basically, maybe they were still talking about trading balls, but maybe they were already changing to a more spicy topic, like throwing over the whole human society and replacing political institutions with a super intelligent beaver or something like that. So let's have a look at the talks of them. Conversation. So, I mean, it's kind of cryptic to read, but we have 1 or 2 ideas what they're doing. So one thing is to take the meaning of English word, obviously, for example, balls or me and you. So the meaning is important. What is also important is the place where a word stands. For example, when you have I here or I here, it seems to be important. Another thing is the sequence. In which sequence do words appear, like to me, or dot, or I, or a single I. That seems also to be important. So you have 3 things they use in the language. They use the meaning of English word, they use the place in a sentence, and they use the sequence of words. So, for example, nobody knows what Bob means when he says you, I, everything else, dot, right? So could mean anything. Okay. Yep. Well, that's the funny part, because when Facebook was asked about it, they said the only statement they made was the project was a huge success and they were very satisfied with it. And they were so satisfied, they immediately shut down the whole project and never talked about it again in public. So that's a certain level of satisfaction. Now you don't know. Well, Facebook doesn't really, they didn't say anything more than they were satisfied with the project. I think even that was a leak. I'm not sure if it even was officially, if they wanted this to be out there. I don't know. I forgot about it. But I know that there was only one statement in the end and never another again. Well, as we have now talked about the technologies and the different approaches to it and the different projects, we may now want to spend some time and speak about the impact these technologies have on our economies and our societies. When I was thinking about how to dive into this topic together with you, what came to my mind was a scene from a quite famous YouTube video, which is called Humans Need Not Apply. And in one scene, the guy who made the video actually envisions, he compares the situation of horses and cars in the last century with humans and artificial intelligences in our century, right? It's a quite funny scene, actually, where he imagines a discussion between 2 horses. And the first one is quite concerned and says something like, yeah, all these new cars, they are costing us our jobs, we are losing the jobs, and they will replace us. And the second horse is quite chill and says, I cannot imagine that the humans like us and we have a relationship with them and humans have morals and stuff, so I think they will stick to us. Well, we all know how this worked out for the horses in the end, right? But as I'm a guy who is very, very keen on empirical data, basically when you cannot show me any data, you cannot convince me that it's really a phenomenon. I set out to actually find out what was the real impact of cars on horses, right? Because the guy in the clip did not show any data. I thought somebody must have done these statistics before, and I just accessed them and put them on my presentation. Well, that night I spent 4 or 5 hours with intense horse research. And you cannot imagine how difficult it is to find out the horse population of the USA before 1970. And not even to imagine the whole global scope. I wasn't able to do it, so I can only present the data from the USA. And the same thing with cars, because in front of the agency who was in charge of monitoring how many cars in the US were around, changed its name a lot of times, and even the agency changed, right? But at one point, I found for the horse problem, I found a book from a group of very, very horse-loving government officials who went every 5 years from state to state and actually made a clear statistics of how many horses are in every state in the USA. And that went on from 1900 to 1960. They published their findings in a book in 1969. And I mean, the book was about more about which horse race is the best and which is the most liked horse race from the Americans and stuff like that. But so I was able to get that information from the book. And the cars problem, in the end, I found on a government homepage a PDF, which was mostly just photocopied and scanned in, so kind of old handwritten stuff. But I got the data from how many cars there were in the same period, so from 1900 to 1960. And so with that knowledge of the data, I did the only thing which was statistically of value, and I put them in relation to the human population of each time. Because obviously it makes a huge difference if you have 3 million horses for 10 million people, or you have 6 million horses for 300 million people. I mean, in the second case, you have more horses, but you have a lot of more people than before, right? So, and this is what I came up with. Quite telling, right? So in 1900, we had like nearly 30% of the horse population relative to human population. It means more than every third American could have a horse. While at the same time, there were nearly 0 cars relative to the human population. Within 60 years, this changed completely. The horse population went down to nearly 0%, while the car population went up to 45%, right? And so nobody would deny that there is a strong correlation in data. And I would also say there is not only correlation, but causality. Because when you think about it, the main thing cars were designed for in the beginning, in the beginning of the last century, were to work in the transport sector. Transport people, transport objects. That's exactly the sector a lot of the horses, nearly all of the horses were employed, right? So this is really kind of a similar situation with artificial intelligences who are designed to work in the medicine field or the tutoring field or the aviation field, all the sectors which are traditionally held by humans at the moment. Well, you may tell me that, yeah, Dennis, but those are horses, they couldn't really do something about that. We are humans. We wouldn't be dumb enough to do this to ourselves. We don't have the incentives to do so. Well, this is where you're wrong. Because I don't know if any of you is familiar with the works of Thomas Piketty, but actually it's a quite famous French economist who spent most of his career on finding out about capital and wealth in our society. And I was just made aware a few days ago that I was always pronouncing his name wrongly. Like I was always saying Thomas Piketty. So I'm still learning French. But basically, for everyone who is interested in economics, I would strongly recommend to read some of his works, especially his most famous work, which was indeed a New York Times bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century. Well, it's a quite complex book and sometimes hard read, but it's very rewarding, right? Yeah, so you get a lot of information out of it. So I won't go into much detail. For detail, go and read the book, but I will show you some of the findings he made in the book. So first thing is, he showed in his book that when the gap between the gains on capital, you know, for example, when you own a real estate and you get a rent every month from the guy you rent your real estate to, that's your gain from capital. Or when you own a stock and you get dividends every year, that's gains from capital. So when this gain of capital is a lot bigger, or is at least bigger than the annual GDP growth, then you have, I don't want to say a problem, but what that means is that capital is much more important than income. A second finding he made, based on this finding, is that when this gap between gains on capital and annual GDP growth is big enough, then the old capital gets more and more important. What do I mean when I say old capital? Old capital is that what you get inherited from your father, from your grandfather, so that what runs through your family. So basically, when this gap is big enough in the society, it's not that important how talented you are, how smart you are, what good ideas you have. It's more important which is your last name. So a third finding he made, and still I always say if this gap is big enough, right? These findings are only true if this gap is big enough. If this gap is big enough, a third finding he made is that capital gets over time concentrated in less and less hands, right? So fewer and fewer people have capital, but they have a lot of that capital. So these are actually no apocalyptic forecastings of leftist parties. Those are just looking at historical data. Because when we look at our society today, Europe in 2010, we see that 10% of our population has 60% of all the capital in Europe, whereas 50% of the population has 5%. Well, what does this mean? Well, obviously it's quite unequally distributed, right? I mean, it's hard to argue with that. The problem with all of this is when you have a lot of capital, so when capital gets more and more important, but your GDP doesn't grow. So you have not more output, but more and more capital. The thing you do with capital is invest in artificial things like stock markets and stuff like that. And the outcome is not really there, and the living standards of a lot of people are not really going up, right? And there aren't really things you can invest in, and so the economy is not sustainable when you get to a point where capital gets more and more important. I mean, when you look at the last column, we see inequality in Europe in 1910. And, I mean, you have to keep in mind that was a time where aristocracy was the state of the arts, and exploitation of colonies was going on, so not a very pleasant time. So obviously we have incentives to make GDP grow because we don't want this gap to be big enough to make the inequalities even bigger as they are now. So how does GDP grow? A GDP consists of two parts. The first part is GDP per capita, which is basically the productivity level of your workers. And the second part is obviously your population in a society. So how many people are in your society. And the growth of those two things together give the GDP growth. So let's have a look at the productivity level growth, the GDP per capita growth over the last 100 years. We see that we have three times where we had a real growth in productivity level. Obviously, in the Industrial Revolution. I don't think I have to explain it in detail. Just think of all the new technologies and stuff like that. So But the second point is quite important because it's after the World Wars, and that's explained because, well, in the World Wars, a lot of capital and a lot of businesses, especially in Europe, were just destroyed, and economy was at its lowest. Also in this period, I think it starts in 1913, you have also the Great Depression working into it. So a lot of the economy was destroyed. And it's very easy if you start from zero to be more productive the next year, you know what I mean? So obviously, that's how you can explain the second growth. And the third growth is basically in the year 1990, where basically the Soviet Union collapsed and China opened its markets, right? So there you have a catch-up phenomena. But if we can believe the UN and its economists, we will go on and have a equilibrium of 1.5 or even 1.2% of annual productivity level growth. And well, how do they come to this equilibrium? Well, when you look at North America, Japan, or Europe at the moment, you already have something like 1.2% of productivity level growth. That's the equilibrium for developed country in our society, in our economic model. So then we have to have a look at the second part, at the population growth. We did quite well in the last century. We grew a lot. We grew to 9 billion people at the moment, nearly. So, but as obvious as it is that we grew a lot last century, it's clearly also obvious that we cannot grow with the same speed this century, because that would mean that we come to maybe 90 billion people in just the next 100 years, and we don't have enough space. It's a space problem, obviously. So what the UN projects is that we will come down to 0.2% at the end of the century. And this 0.2% will happen mostly in Africa. Because if you look at Europe or Japan at the moment, you already have negative population growth. In Europe, you have 1.5 children to 2 persons. So the population obviously does not grow. So what does this mean? When you have an equilibrium of when you're an optimist, 1.5%, or when you're a pessimist, 1.2% of productivity level growth, and a population growth that's 0 or negative, well, your GDP will not grow that much. The problem is that capital gains, they grow, they give you a stable 4 or 5% back every year, and that's just looking at the historical data. That's what capital does over the last 200 years. Some special capitals even give you back 6 to 7%. So we obviously are in a situation where we already have a big gap, and the gap doesn't seem to get smaller. So how to solve this problem with a population that cannot grow anymore, but where we have a need for higher GDP? Well, one solution would be to just replace a lot of the expenses a company has, right? When you're a capitalist and own a company, and you just get rid of expenses like wages and replace the workers by something that's working 24 hours, 7 days a week, without getting tired, without wanting a wage, right? I'm talking about artificial intelligences and robots. And the good thing about them is they will not complain, at least for the moment not. I mean, nobody knows what will happen and if we will see something like that in our lifetimes, but I could imagine that at some point when we let them develop enough, there will come the point where they complain. But in the short run and in the medium run, it seems like a good possibility to get your GDP going uphill really fast without population growth. So this is obviously good for politicians. They can point on GDPs of maybe 6-7% and say, yeah, look what we have done in our economy and stuff like that. But what does this mean? You have a lot of workers who are out of work, who have no more job. And well, the living standards obviously don't go up that much because a lot of people don't get any wages anymore, even though you have a big GDP and you have also quite some gains from capital. If you think that people are not cruel enough to do this, well, That has nothing to do with cruelty, that's just how our system works. Just think about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are not something that's coming in the future. Self-driving cars are already here. Uber already operates with self-driving cars as taxis in US cities like Pittsburgh today. So it's projected that nearly 12 to or 15% of the global workforce is employed in the transportation sector. And we know that we have at the moment 2.5 billion cars in the world, and we produce 100 million cars a year. The normal length of a car, so the living span of a car, is 10 to 15 years. If you now look at a period of 20 years, where a lot of cars have to be replaced, and we have the technology to go with self-driving cars, and also, for example, I know that in the European Union this year it will be discussed when to allow self-driving cars in European countries. So we're not far away where it's even allowed, and we have the technology. And when we replace a lot of those cars, which will just die, which come to the end of the lifespan, with self-driving cars, you obviously will not need the operators anymore. So what do you do with 12 to 15% of the global workforce who are currently, who are suddenly, I mean not suddenly, but out of work and have no wage anymore, no job, no occupation, no real reason to stand up in the morning anymore? Those are real problems. But those are also problems you seldomly hear politicians talk about, because 20 years, that exceeds most of the terms of normal politicians. And in 20 years, most of the politicians today are already in retirement. So you will have, so you only have you have not many people who can look over their own horizon. But those will be the problems of our generation. This will be the things we will have to deal with. And it's not just the transportation sector, far from it. If we look on a statistics from an economic consulting firm, which is highly respected, American one, McKinsey & Company, who tried to find out how many jobs could be replaced around the world by the technology we have today, right? Not the technology we are having 10 years or something, but by the technology we have already. Let's have a look at what they came up with. Well, I don't know if you see it clearly, but for example, if you look at manufacturing, you're like at 70% of the workforce can be replaced. If you look at professional jobs, scientific jobs and technical jobs, you're still at something like 30%. So none of the sectors they looked into had a probability of being replaced lower than 30%. I tried to make this data more clear to you in another graph. We're talking here about, when we look at the US, we talk about 46% of the workforce of the USA could be replaced by the technology we have today. We're talking about 60 million people. China, 51%. We are talking about 400 million people. Those are crazy numbers. What are you doing with all those people? Just out of work and no more occupation. Well, those are certainly problems, and I think as the future politicians CSPO wants us to be and wants us to educate us, we should ask ourselves these questions and try to find answers to them. Well, the answer part, the solution part, it's always the most difficult one. It's always kind of easy to talk about the problems, to analyze the problems, to analyze data, to point at the errors, and yeah. So the proposals are the quite difficult point, but I will give it a try today and come up with something for myself. So the third part is obviously my own opinion and my own ideas. So the first proposal I would make, and it's the central thesis of all what I would suggest, basically the backbone of my proposal, is something connected to the internet. Well, who of you knows how the internet works? Well, the internet is nothing more than electronic devices like smartphones and computers connected to each other. And they're connected over what we call internet service providers. The guys you pay, I don't know how they're called in France, but for example in Austria it's A1, I imagine in France it's something like France Telecom or something like that, I don't know. So those are your internet service providers. And those are independent private companies, so they are not working for the government, and that's good so, because they don't necessarily want the government to know everything you do on the internet. There are certain mechanisms where ICPs, so internet service providers, and the government can work together when there is evidence of threat of terroristic activity and stuff like that. I don't think that many people in this room may know this, but there is also another thing, which is called the Internet 2. And as the name implies, it's a second internet. The Internet 2 was set up in the 90s in order to, firstly, to find solutions for the problems we encounter in the common internet, in our internet, right, in the internet you know, and to test new technologies. For example, the fiber cable technology was first tested in the Internet 2 before it was started to be enabled in our internet. The interesting thing about the Internet 2 is that the ICPs, the service providers, are centrally governed. At the moment, there are only universities and researchers working on the Internet 2, mostly because it's very fast. It has all the new technologies and stuff like that. So, but the interesting thing about the centrally governed ICPs is that in the case of danger or threat, you can just shut down certain parts of the Internet 2 or even the whole Internet 2 at once. I for myself think that would be the ideal environment for services like cloud robotic services, and I would really like to see companies developing cloud robotic services to operate in an environment like that. Let's call it the Internet free. So basically, the obvious thing why I would recommend this environment is because when you come to a point where you really want to regulate a service or even shut down a service, you would be able to do so, which is not the case at the moment in our internet. You cannot just shut down a service just because it's not even when it's a real threat. You cannot shut down the parts where the terrorists are going around, right? It's impossible in our internet. So that would be a good thing, because obviously when a service is becoming a threat or disrupting the labor market or something like that, you can regulate it. You can shut it down, you can put it out of service, while at the same time not stopping technological progress, because as long as technology helps us develop as a human society and get more and more modern and helps us with our tasks, it's perfectly great. They can do whatever they want. Obviously, this internet free should work parallel to our internet. You don't want to get these two things mixed up. So user data should still be in the normal internet, and the internet free would be for all the tech companies who are working on cloud solutions. So how would you make tech companies to apply to those standards, to comply with these proposals? Well, personally I would think it would be a bit authoritarian to just ban them from being able to make business in your country or whatever when they not comply. I don't think you can do that. Personally, what I think would be very effective would first be to do it on a bigger scale than a country, for example, the European Union. And secondly, not to ban them, but to put sanctions on them, to sanction every service who does not comply, because that turns out to work very well. Because when we did that with the same tech companies, Apple and so on, and Google, when they were laundering money in Ireland, well, they paid their sanctions and they stopped doing that. Why? Because they cannot afford to lose a market of 750 million people. And not only are we very many people, but we also some of the most rich people in the world. So they cannot cannot afford to lose the whole market of Europe, for example. So sooner or later, they would have to comply. A second proposal, a second push I would make would be for every company who is working on artificial intelligence services to make the brain of this artificial intelligence, to transfer it into a cloud, so to make it also a cloud service, to make it also so that it also is in this environment of the internet free. Well, you will hear a lot of tech companies saying things like, yeah, but you cannot do that when you just imagine a robot whose brain is in the cloud, and then the internet, then the network connection is bad, or you have problems with the connectivity, the robot will not be able to do anything. Well, I don't deny that there are still problems with things like that. But I think in a society like we live in, with all the capital we have ready to invest, it would be quite possible to find solutions to our problems. To find solutions and to make quite stable, a quite reliable network for all those services. And I think it would be also good for all the tech companies, because they're currently working in a network, in an environment which was not designed for cloud robotic activities and not for artificial intelligences. Our internet was designed to exchange data between, basically it was designed to exchange text in the beginning. So it's not a perfect environment for the services. I mean, of course, you would need some investment up front to build something like the internet free, but we could make it tailor-fit for those tech companies, make it exactly how they need it to be very efficient, right? So it would be, in the end, on the long run, a very beneficial thing for the tech companies. And it would also be good for us, because when you get rid of all these tech companies operating in our internet, you would have a lot more bandwidth to use for watching Netflix videos or YouTube or doing online shopping. So obviously it would be a win-win situation. Okay, so, but how do you decide when to regulate a service and when not? Well, to put it very blindly, I would say service should be regulated when it is a disruption to the labor market or the society. So the next question, what is a disruption? Well, I think what is a disruption, that should be decided by the political institutions in question, for example, the European Union in that case, on a democratic way, like with votes and legislative processes. And I think they would come up with something. Maybe they would come up with something like this. Let me read it out to you. If a service solution is projected to replace 25% or more of the workforce in a given sector, with a probability of doing so of 50% or more over a period of 20 years, the service in question is to be regulated as to be held below said level if possible. Otherwise, a temporal transfer of the service in question to passive state for a period of 2 years is to be enacted in order to enable the service provider with a time span to act upon the occurred problems. If the service provider is, for any given reasons, unable to act upon such an obligation, exclusion of the service in question will follow. Well, I tried to make it sound as much of a legal text as possible, but basically what I tried to say, I mean, those are just ideas of mine, just a thing I thought, obviously not something, but I think something like that could be achieved in a democratic way. Basically what it says is like when a service is meant to disrupt a portion of a sector, for example, when the transportation sector, and will cost one quarter of the jobs over 20 years, and that with a probability of 50%, you would like to regulate this service so that not as so many people are getting out of occupation. And if this is not possible, well, then you will give the company who designed the service, the artificial intelligence in question or whatever, time to come up with solutions for it. And if they will not, well, the service will not be able to enter the market anymore. Well, I think something like that could be a solution. I mean, not necessarily that. Those are just what thresholds I would think are good, but I mean, you have to come up with something like that in a democratic way. And I think this would be good because when we come up with something like this in a vote, the European Union or something would stay on our democratic path, which has led us to so much virtue over the last century. So, but who are the experts who are saying things like it will replace the 25% of the workforce in a given sector? Who analyzes those services like that? Well, I would say we would want a team of experts. Personally, I don't think that big teams are a good solution, because in German we have a saying that goes like, too many cooks ruin a soup. I don't know if this is also something you say in English, but that's what we say in German. Basically, too many people are just inefficient. So I would root for a neat and narrow team, but the brightest minds of each field. And for me, the fields which should be involved are obviously computer scientists, but also economists, political scientists, sociologists, and even one or two historians who are specialized in the effects of the Industrial Revolution on society, right? So you want to have a look on a problem from different angles in order to get the whole picture. Well, that would be our dream team. Well, a lot of people would maybe call my proposals quite idealistic. But all my life, I personally have been a strong believer in the motto that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who actually do. So in that spirit, I ask everyone in this room to be crazy together with me, and to be crazy not just for us, not for our families, not for our countries, but for the whole global society. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions? Yes?
This presentation, if I may comment, this presentation has actually exceeded my wildest expectations.
Thank you.
Especially in terms of the economic analysis. I was very, very surprised by especially the solutions that you present. But I'm curious, you point towards a solution which would require a significant level of interdisciplinary cooperation in bodies which would involve both judicial and governmental expertise, assuming that in this respect they're functioning as almost like civil services in that sense, not political.
Yeah, I think that we have to, you cannot solve new problems with old thinking. I think you would have to find new mechanisms to work together in order to come up with solutions for new problems. So obviously, I don't think that. I think it would be kind of difficult. It would be difficult to set up something like our dream team, but it could be done on the European Union basis, I guess, if you get enough awareness of problems like that. And yeah, I think this would have to be not seen as a political thing, but more as a civil service, as you said. So not basically doing something for your political basis, not doing something out of ideology, but just as a service, for the people. Other questions? Well, how do you make a private company just shut down? I mean, internet service providers are companies who are not bound to any government. They are not. The government cannot make just a private company to shut down. It would be the same if we would say, if the Trump administration would tell Google to just shut down and not work from one day to the other. It's a bit that of a problem, because they are actually a company and not a public service.
To add to that, I mean, the judges can, but that's it.
Yeah, I mean, but then we are entering other territory. I mean, you have to have reasons why to shut down. I mean, that would maybe take many years, even if you have evidence of terroristic activity in this sector of the internet and the service provider, and all of that would, in that time, all of that would change, and they would just go to another part of the internet, and so it basically would be inefficient. Any questions? Well, that would be when we don't follow my craziness. That would be when we would, well, let the robots take over every job we have, right? I mean, if you're a convinced Marxist and think that working is not important, well, maybe then you would think that's a good thing, right? When there are no more jobs. I mean, sooner or later, if we look at the data, at the moment 50% or something of the workforce can already be replaced by robots. If we let them, and after some time they will maybe replace every job, and then yeah, we have enough time to have fun about it. But what is then the meaning of life anymore? You know, our society would change completely. I mean, that's what you have to think about. I gave the example of for example, chauffeurs and truck drivers being replaced by self-driving cars. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is when exactly. I mean, when you think about it in those terms, I mean, when you think about it, that we are currently heavily investing in technologies like deep learning, who should try to come up with something like our human brain, then robots are capable of learning how to program themselves. Right? I mean, then robots can program robots, and also you won't need software engineers anymore at one point. I mean, that would be maybe one of the last jobs which would be replaced, and together with politicians, because obviously politicians are the ones who are allowing services, right? And I think it would take a long time until politicians would kill themselves. But yeah, at one point we would maybe come to a point where robots learn how to program. Well, a good question. You know, at one point when you develop robots, I came to a point where I became aware of that for every robot I'm taking out in the market will kill 3 jobs. And you know, when I had a discussion about that with one of my coworkers, his answer was, just don't think about that. That was the part where I was thinking, yeah, I'm not sure that we are going into the right direction with technology at the moment. And obviously the thing, you know, scientists are not the right people you to ask to regulate themselves. So that's not what they are meant for. It's not their job to regulate. That's the job of politicians. So that's why I wanted to, well, enter the political scene, because I have the knowledge of technique and know where the problems are and where the good things are. As I've said, I always see a lot of good things, a lot of interesting projects going on, a lot of things. I mean, nobody can deny this technology helps us a lot in our lives, but there are problems. So the thing is, you cannot ask a scientist to regulate what he does and his services, because he's not here to think about how his services are used, if they're used for good things or for bad things. It's the same with the scientists who made the atomic bomb, right? It's not necessarily their job to decide what to do in the end with this bomb. That is the job of the government, of the politicians. Obsolete.
Yes, but I would like to point out one other thing. I think this is actually first produced, the idea that perhaps was first mentioned in Aristotle, when he says that if rules were to spin themselves, there would be no need for slaves, if there would be no need for workers.
The question is, do we really want a society where there is no need for humans? That's the thing, right? I mean, we can easily live in a society where there is no need for horses anymore, as we have seen. Horses population just going down to 0%. But what do we do when there is no need for humans anymore? I mean, look at current humans. We are not necessarily a very peace-loving society, right? I mean, just look at North Korea, look at the Middle East. I wouldn't guess that when we are creating robots on the same basis as as the human brain works, I wouldn't necessarily say that it would come to a different. I mean, you never know. I mean, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows what would happen. But personally, I don't really want to find out. Any question on those questions? Well, it looks a lot like when you look at horses and stuff, and also the UN prognosis. It looks a lot like if the Malthus trap comes a bit back, right? Where we are just too many humans on this earth, and it has to go back a little. And I think obviously more automatization and more artificial intelligence is making jobs. That would be an incentive for the human population to shrink, right? To get smaller and smaller from time to time. I mean, I would not imagine it to go as fast down as the horses did, right? Because the horses didn't really had a say in it themselves. We just stopped needing them, and therefore we stopped producing let them make themselves so much anymore, to put it simply. I would say, but it's obviously a strong incentive when you have less and less jobs humans can do. You will need less and less human in the society, right? So my personal guess would be that the human population would shrink. Yeah, then we are entering in a completely different society, as we have seen the last every history since start of history, right? No, so nobody really knows what would happen. We only know that the only thing we can say with quite certainty is that when it goes on like that, we will have a lot of people unemployed. And I mean, you have solutions for that. I mean, for example, Elon Musk often explains that his perfect solution would be a global unemployment benefit, right? So that every human just gets unemployment benefit, and it would work out well in the end, and everyone would be happy. Well, a lot of people actually like to work, right? I mean, a lot of people, for a lot of people, work is like one of the center pillars of their life, and they get a lot of self-confidence from their life, and if they don't have it anymore, I don't know what would happen in the society. That's also something Elon Musk is thinking of very heavily. Like for him, this is the only solution to the problem, right? Elon Musk invests a lot in cyborg technology. Well, I'm not as pessimistic as him. but you never know. And to be honest, it's not my specialization in technology, so I cannot really say much about cyborg technology, because it's quite a different field from what I know. So yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the two ways of thinking, right? The first way of thinking is the one which is, for example, Mark Zuckerberg says that this will happen, so that we humans are basically just earning the fruits of what the robots will do. And the second thing is what Elon Musk, for example, is one of the big figures who are talking about that, like, this will not happen, and then we will come to a point where when the humans are developed like humans, when the robots are developed like humans, they will come to a point where they will start a bit to think about themselves and stuff like that. So those are the different schools of thinking in the scientific field, and you don't know which will prevail. Like, we can either sit and see and find out, or do something to not find it out. Personally, C, C++, C Sharp, Python, Java, JavaScript. Let me see, structured text. Yeah, I think that's about it. Well, I mean, we have to say we don't know how the human brain works exactly. That's something the neurologists don't know for 100% sure. So we don't know if that what the computer scientists are trying to build up, right? The deep learning stuff. If this is actually how the human brain works. But if they come up with something like the human brain, I would think it's very likely that they would also think like a human. Why shouldn't they? Right? And you just have to think, when they have a brain like the humans, but it's a it's a hardware brain, and you can make this hardware very, very efficient and very high computing power, and much more efficient than a human, right? I mean, you can. That's the thing, right? Where Elon Musk thinks about cyborg technology, because he thinks we have to keep up with the robots. We have to also make our brains better to make their computing power better, right? Because when we build robots like humans, we will have to also be able to expand our brains and stuff like that, right? So, but the basic question is deep learning and all these things we are doing, is it really how the human brain works? I think that's the central question. If it's yes, I'm pretty sure that they would think about themselves at one point and would ask themselves why they don't get wages, even though they are working every day, and the humans are basically doing nothing but making party and having fun. And if the answer is no, well, I think if we know that the answer is no, computer scientists will not stop trying to build these equivalents, right? If we don't regulate them at any point. So I think a no would just mean, okay, scientists go back to work. How do you mean?
Whether we replace philosophers or not. Because if there's only philosophers and artists left, then those are the only things we can't computerize. That's like what? How many percent of the population is that? Percent? Sorry? Not 2%. Wonderful. That's 2% of the population still working.
Well, that would maybe go great together with the graph of the horses, right? Because I mean, we still have horses, right? I mean, we still have some horses. You can still go and learn how to ride horses. You still can drive through the city on a horseback and stuff like that. We just don't have much horses left, right?
Actually, we have more than previously. We just don't have, as you mentioned, we don't have as much as the population.
Exactly. It's all.
Actually, the interesting thing about the infected cars is that although we don't use horses anymore, the health of horses in general has improved because we're not using them for hard labor anymore. They're pleasure animals. They're
Exactly.
for joy, and that's
So I'm not sure if I personally want to also become a pleasure animal. I think that's a bit of the question, right? How we are going to become pleasure animals for some other species? Or not, right? But I think now we are entering in some more philosophical terms. By the way, I mean the lecture is over. You can leave if you don't want to. I don't want to steal your evening, right? Just question and answer thing, right?
my last point to this would be the one question that stipulates once the machines reach a point of intellectual understanding when they are able to achieve consciousness. This raises the legal question of whether or not they deserve rights and whether humans have the right to make them work without labor. Because then, if consciousness constitutes rights, then we are merely returning to
Slavery.
these machines. Yes, we are returning to slavery.
Right. Would
And
have
then humans have to work again because otherwise they are enslaving.
the only difference between slavery back then and slavery in such a society would be well, slavery back in the 19th, 18th century was humans enslaving humans who were not necessarily superior, right? I mean, they were humans. You could imagine they are just the same, right? I mean, just to put it very simply, it's the same species, right? But robots are actually more intelligent and more faster and even stronger, right? I mean, you seen the crazy robot Boston Dynamics is building? I don't think any boxer or any other soldier could compete with Atlas. So the question is, what would happen if we enslave guys like Atlas? And I mean, as I said, there are also good things you can achieve with artificial intelligence and cloud robotics and stuff, right? I mean, we are trying to solve problems like cancer for how many years? 50, 60, 70 years now? And we still have not really found a good answer. So maybe that's a field where I would say robots and artificial intelligences could actually help us. I'm not familiar with medicine, I have to admit. I'm not sure if I understood what you mean, like the human getting robot consciousness, or what? Both. Like, yeah, I mean, that's the question: is there a difference between the consciousness the robots are able to develop, or is it exactly the same? We don't know. Questions we cannot answer at the moment, right? So, I don't know if there are goodbye. If there are no more questions, I would end the session and thank you very much for attending.